The Loxjie P20 is a pretty good hybrid amp. The Bellari HA540 Mark II is also a good hybrid amp, but the two devices have significant differences. In this video, I want to tell you about the sound signatures of both. I want to explain the costs involved for these amps, what headphones they can drive, and whether one is a better value than the other. Those who want a quick answer, well, you'll have to skip to the conclusion and miss the analysis. I will discuss a little bit about the amps and their pricing. I will then discuss the test setup. The test involves the following headphones: the 600 ohm Beyerdynamic DT880, the Sennheiser HD6xx, the Sivga Phoenix, and the Rane commercial RH50. I will then talk about the value propositions both units offer. And finally, you'll get my overall conclusion. The P20 is $100 cheaper than the Bellari. That is a huge first difference. Next, the P20 has balanced XLR input and output. The Bellari doesn't. The P20 uses two tubes. The Bellari uses one. The P20 has a digital volume display. The Bellari doesn't. Both units are very good build quality. Both are fairly similar in size. Both use an external power adapter. You can tube roll on both units. But the devices have different overall costs. In my P20 unboxing, I told you that this is a basic hybrid amp that needs some TLC. This increases the cost significantly. Out of the box, the P20 is fine, but nothing special. It's a cheap way to get balanced XLR, but beyond that, it offers nothing of note. In order to use the P20 to its full potential, you must do two things. You must get a different power supply. The P20's power supply is subpar, which is a complaint many have voiced. Second, you must swap tubes. The stock tubes on the P20 are downright awful. They lack dynamics and a tube sound. I thought it best to compare the two amps in what I think are their best upgraded forms. For the P20, I used the Western Electric 396A tubes, which were about $100. You can certainly use a much cheaper set of tubes from Riverstone Audio, which will cost about $50. The differences between the 396A and the Riverstone are noticeable, but if you don't want to spend a lot of money on tubes, then the Riverstone are a decent place to stop. I also upgraded the power supply and used the hifi iPower X. This is another $100 on top. You can use a much cheaper power supply. Some recommend a TiVo power supply. In order to control your costs, I purchased the Go9 12-volt 60-watt power supply, which is about $20. Both the hifi and Go9 are an improvement over the stock power supply. However, in my weeks of testing, the hifi seemed to make the P20 perform louder at the same volume settings. There is a huge cost difference between these two power supplies, so I decided to use the Go9 for this particular test. I assumed most people would prefer to keep costs to a minimum, especially if they would rather spend a little bit more money for better tubes. For the Bellari, I purchased the Telefunken ECC83 tube, which was sold by Fisher. This tube was manufactured in 1962 and cost me $56. In the several months I have used the Bellari, I have never felt as if its power adapter needs a replacement. Also, in my P20 unboxing, I mentioned I was not getting different volume output from the XLR headphone jack. People pointed out that this was irregular. I therefore bought another P20 from Amazon and have used it for the last 2 weeks. The new P20 is what is being used here, and its XLR jack does provide more power than the 1/4 inch. This is the overall cost of the amps as I use them in this test. The P20 costs $100. I spent $100 on the Western Electric tubes. I upgraded to a $20 power supply. The total cost is $220. The Bellari costs $200. I spent $56 on the Telefunken tube. The total cost is $256. Of course, you can opt for a more expensive power supply for the P20, cheaper tubes, or leave everything stock. My preference here was to provide the best bang for your buck experience. I placed greater weight on the tubes than power supply. After all, if the $20 power supply does fine, then I would rather concentrate on tubes on this tube amp. Consequently, I believe the overall cost here is fairly reasonable. Both amps were plugged into the Soncause LA-QX-D1. This is a portable DAC with balanced XLR and RCA output. I think this is a fantastic DAC with a clean, neutral sound signature, plug-and-play nature, and outputs to the XLR and RCA at the same time. The P20 was connected via XLR and the Bellari over RCA. They received the exact same connection at exactly the same time from the Soundcause. I powered the Soundcause using my fully charged external power bank. When the Soundcause first turns on, its default volume is at 50%. You should increase the volume to max, which is what I did. I played music through Amazon Music HD. I utilized the P20's balanced output along with its quarter-inch output depending on the headphones. On the Bellari, I used only the quarter-inch output. I used either the stock headphone cables or Hart audio cables. I did not use any exotic components. Now, let's get to the tests. The first and foremost test is to determine if these amps can actually drive something like the 600 ohm DT880. There are some comments that these headphones require a silly amount of power, advocating the use of speaker amplifiers. This is both dangerous and utterly unnecessary. I tested a hypothesis that the 880 requires higher output impedance, not ever more greater amplification. My repeated testing indicates that the hypothesis is correct. Moreover, Beyerdynamic confirmed this when I emailed them several weeks ago. The P20's output impedance is 47 ohms. The Bellari's output impedance is 8 ohms to 2000 ohms. Justin Allen at Bellari stated that this is a constant variation between 8 and 2000 ohms. The P20's power output is 175 milliwatts at 600 ohms through the balanced XLR. It is 29 milliwatts at 600 ohms through the unbalanced quarter-inch. The Bellari is 664 milliwatts into 30 ohms. I first plugged the 880 into the P20 through the balanced connection. At negative 20 decibels, the DT880 was plenty loud. The sound I heard involved emphasized bass with slow decay. Vocals remained clear, though there was some melding between bass and mids. As I listened to pop, hip-hop, classical, and ambient music, I never felt that the 880 was not recreating a particular frequency. The sub-bass rumble in Mountains by Hans Zimmer was easily audible from beginning to end. When the crescendo hits, the organ does not become distorted, and the other instruments are clearly apparent. In Pure Water by Mustard and Migos, the sparkle of the vocals was palpable. The vocals were clear and distinct. The bass was present and elevated. However, the bass did not distort and did not overwhelm the mids, though some melding did occur. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the 880 presented each group set without trouble. I heard excellent treble extension without harshness. The horns and brass had natural timbre that cut through the mix. I switched to the quarter-inch jack on the P20. At negative 20 decibels, the headphones were a comfortable volume, though not the same volume as on the XLR. I was able to get similar volume at negative 13 decibels. I replayed the tracks on the quarter-inch. Other than adjusting volume every once in a while to keep in check, I heard little audible difference. On some occasions, it appeared that the XLR had slightly clearer reproduction of the bass, but that could easily have been due to incorrect volume matching. Suffice it to say, the P20 can in fact drive the 880. I then switched to the Bellari. The volume knob goes from 7 o'clock, which is mute, all the way around to 5 o'clock, which is maximum. At 9 o'clock, the 880 was a comfortable volume. At approximately 10 o'clock, the volume seemed the same as negative 20 decibels on the Loxjie through its XLR jack. The Bellari provided a substantially clearer presentation than the P20 did. It was, in fact, night and day difference in my opinion. On Mountains, for example, the P20's bass reproduction was thicker, muddier than the Bellari's. In comparison, the P20 sounded as if there was a bedsheet draped over the speaker. The sub-bass rumble was present, but not as emphasized as it had been on the P20. The crescendo was faster and clearer on the Bellari. The organ was more restrained and the sub-bass rumble far more separated from the rest of the mix. On Pure Water, the vocals were again cleaner, clearer. They were easily 2 steps ahead of the mix. On the P20, the vocals sounded about shoulder to shoulder with the rest of the instruments. The bass was faster on the Bellari with shorter reverberation. The vocals had their sparkle, similar to what I heard on the P20. On Scherzo for X-Wings, all the instruments sounded cleaner and clearer than on the P20. There was slightly better instrument separation on the Bellari. the horns and brass had a tiny bit more treble emphasis. In comparison, the P20 rolled off the treble spike just a little bit. Again, I must emphasize that the Bellari easily drove the 880. Soundstage on the 880 was above average to wide. The different sound signatures I heard can be attributed to the topographies of the individual amps, the power and impedance output, and the tubes. One amp was not worse than the other, they were merely different. Now that you know how I explain sound signature, I will dispense with reciting what I heard with each song. This will make the video a little bit shorter. If you skip the last section, you should watch it. I plugged the HD6xx into the P20 using the XLR jack. I achieved comfortable volume at negative 27 decibels. Of course, the bass sounded different than it did on the 880. On the 6xx, the bass was thicker, with sub-bass and mid-bass melding considerably. The reverberation of the bass was slightly longer on the 6xx than on the 880. Vocals were usually no more than one step ahead of the mix. They melded slightly with the bass, but were not overwhelmed by them. Multiple vocalists usually did not meld into one voice and had a natural timbre. The vocals had an intimacy to them. They sounded fairly close, thick, and lacked some micro details. This is perfectly in line with the HD6xx character. Treble was rolled off noticeably, and more so than on the 880. It seemed that instruments such as horns and brass were pushed into a broom closet and told to play. This isn't a bad experience, just different. Anyone who is treble sensitive will appreciate the more reduced treble signature. Instrument separation was about average. Although I could hear group sets in an orchestral piece, I could never hear individual instruments within a group. I switched to the 1/4-inch jack on the P20. I adjusted volume to negative 23 decibels. This appeared to be a similar volume as through negative 27 decibels on balanced XLR. The sound signature of the 6xx did not change. I next switched to the Bellari. I achieved similar volume on the P20 with the Bellari's volume knob at just below 9 o'clock. At exactly 9 o'clock, the volume was just a little bit beyond what I heard on the P20. The bass through the Bellari was a little cleaner and faster. Whereas the P20's rendition of the bass was thick, somewhat muddier, and involved sub-bass and mid-bass melding, the Bellari's was cleaner, clearer. The sub-bass and mid-bass still melded, but not to the same degree as on the P20. Vocals sounded a little clearer on the Bellari. The difference was not night and day. At most, I would say that the Bellari provided slightly less melding between bass and mids, giving the impression that the vocals were more forward. A/B testing as songs played showed the difference was in fact slight. Treble representation was similar to the P20's. Once again, the horns and brass sounded rolled off. The Bellari provided slightly more clarity in treble instruments, but nothing significant. There was no harshness or peakiness. The 6xx has a particular sound signature, which I think was complemented by both amps. The material difference in this test is the following. Soundstage on the 6xx was about average on both. The P20 has a slight bass emphasis that provides more sub-bass and mid-bass melding. The Bellari provides a little bit more clarity. There is no doubt that both amps easily drive the 6xx. Both let the 6xx shine, and the tube's effects for each amp is slightly different. The Sivga is a new acquisition of mine. It is the newest headphone from this company and is a proprietary dynamic driver design. I plugged it into each amp using their respective 1/4-inch connections. I first tried the P20. Immediately upon connecting the Sivga, I heard audible noise. This was the tube harmonics. The noise faded into the background when music was playing, but it was evident when the music paused. At negative 30 decibels, the Sivga got comfortably loud. At negative 26 decibels, it was maximum volume for me. I kept the volume at around negative 28 decibels. The bass was quick, with good separation between sub-bass and mid-bass. Whereas melding in the bass region was obvious on the 6xx, it was hard to find on the Sivga. There was excellent sub-bass extension without bloating. More to the point, the bass had excellent separation from the mids with little to no melding. Vocals were easily 2 steps ahead of the mix. Hip-hop songs had sparkle without that sparkle being overly obvious. Vocalists were always clear, distinct from the rest of the instruments. Multiple vocalists had their individual tonalities and rarely melded. Acoustic guitars, drums, piano, these instruments had natural timbre and decay. All of these instruments sounded separate from the vocalists. In other words, the instruments never overwhelmed the vocals in any song from any genre that I played. Treble was well extended without harshness. Whereas the 6xx rolled off treble, the Sivga provided more energy. This energy did not equate to peakiness, just more treble detail. Horns and brass were not harsh or ear-piercing, but were accurate. Those instruments cut through the mix like hot knife through delicious butter churned by a Mennonite singing gangsta's paradise. I switched to the Bellari next. Do you remember the tube noise I mentioned earlier? It was not present on the Bellari, ever. I plugged the Sivga into the Bellari, did not play a song, and turned the volume knob to max, then back to mute. I heard no noise and certainly nothing like what I heard on the P20. I was able to roughly volume match with the Bellari's volume at around 8 o'clock. The Bellari presents more clarity than the P20. Bass instruments sound cleaner on the Bellari. Sub-bass and mid-bass have just a tiny bit more separation. The separation of bass for mids was slightly more prevalent on the Bellari, but not by a significant measure. Vocals were clear and distinct. Hip-hop songs had sparkle without harshness. Vocals sounded almost the same between the two amps, with the Bellari showing slightly more clarity. Instruments such as guitars, drums, and piano remained separate entities from the vocals. Treble presentation was about the same between the two amps. Treble seemed just a little clearer on the Bellari. However, just as with the P20, horns and brass did not get harsh or ear-piercing. The Sivga had above-average to wide soundstage. Both amps drove the Sivga without problems. The reason I chose the RH50 over any other of my headphones is because I want to test cheap headphones on these amps. If someone has a limited budget, then they should have a chance to understand if their affordable headphones pair well with either of these amps. The RH50 is a clean, clear headphone. It has a slight treble spike and slight bass roll-off. Sub-bass is often not fully reproduced on this headphone, and treble can become a little hot to someone who is treble sensitive. I plugged the RH50 into the P20. Just as with the Sivga, I heard the tube hum. This noise disappeared with music playing, but always returned when the audio was not playing. Negative 27 decibels was comfortable volume. The P20 adds some bass rumble to the RH50. The separation of sub-bass and mid-bass is pretty much missing. I heard just, bass. There was some distortion in the bass at high volume. There was just a little bit of melding between bass and mids. However, vocals were still audible. Vocals appeared about one step ahead of the mix. Hip-hop songs had sparkle, though it sounded more grainy. Such sparkle was smoother on previous headphones that I had tested. Guitars, drums, piano all sounded distinct and separate from the vocals. Singers with natural sibilance had that sibilance recreated and slightly emphasized. There is some grain in the vocals, especially from vocalists like Orla Gartland. Treble rendition was less clear here than on the Sivga. Of all the headphones tested so far, the RH50 definitely had the most emphasis in the treble region. Horns and brass had lots of energy, and increasing volume beyond negative 27 decibels would cause ear fatigue. I then switched to the Bellari. As with the Sivga on this amp, the RH50 did not display any noise or hum as it had on the P20. I achieved rough volume parity with the Bellari's volume knob at just above mute, around 730. The bass was a little leaner on the Bellari than on the P20. There was more clarity in the bass and more sub-bass and mid-bass distinction. The bass and vocals did not meld nearly as much as on the Bellari. Vocals were about 2 steps ahead in the mix. Vocals were clear and obvious. Hip-hop songs had sparkle, but not the grainy kind that I heard on the P20. Guitars, drums, and piano sounded about the same on the Bellari as on the P20. They were equally separated from the vocals. Sibilance was much better controlled on the Bellari, however. Whereas Orla Gartland sounded grainy and a bit harsh on the P20, her voice was smooth and her sibilance well controlled on the Bellari. Multiple vocalists were noticeably more easily heard on the Bellari than on the P20. Treble was nearly identical between the P20 and Bellari. However, there was less grain on the Bellari than on the P20. The short of it is that if you dislike treble, then the RH50 is not the headphone for you, no matter what amp you use. Soundstage was about average on the RH50. Value judgments are an individual assessment. Some believe that $2,000 DACs are good value, and others think that a $100 DAC is plenty. It is easier to make value propositions with simple solid-state amps, since you either like them or you don't. Either they fit your setup or they don't. With tube hybrids, there's a little bit more involved. As I demonstrated in previous videos, tube rolling the P20 and Bellari does affect the sound signatures. Changing power supplies help the P20 considerably. At the risk of sounding biased, I believe that the setup I used here for each amp was the most cost-effective one. I strongly believe that the P20 needs upgrades. The power supply and stock tubes need to be changed as soon as you can. Sure, you don't need to spend $100 on the power supply. A $20 power supply will do. Nor do you need to spend $100 on tubes where the $50 Riverstone tubes will suffice. However, you can get better tubes than the Riverstone. Whether you want to spend the extra cash on the P20 is completely up to you. In my opinion, unless you already have tubes lying about, $50 to $100 is the most I'd recommend spending on upgrading tubes on the P20. On the other hand, the Bellari does not need to be upgraded. Its power supply is just fine. Its stock tube by Ruby is suited to the amp. Unlike the P20, you can have lots of fun with the stock Bellari tube. Do you think it's better to pay $100 for the P20 and gradually upgrade the components? Or is it better to spend $200 and not feel the need to upgrade at all? If you were to ask me, I think the issue comes down to how much you want to tinker. If you want to experiment with power supplies and tubes, then the P20 will actually require you to do that. If you want something that is hassle-free, the Bellari can offer that. You know, some have commented that certain headphones need a lot of power to be properly driven. That type of argument has merit in some cases, but not all. Take the DT880 as an example. It is evident that the 600 ohm variant does not require a speaker amp. In fact, modest amps like the Liquid Spark can drive the 880 just fine. If you don't subscribe to my output impedance theory, then you have to explain how low amplification devices like the Magni, Liquid Spark, P20, and others can drive the 880. True, all of those amps drive these headphones differently. Some may sound good, and some not. If you're looking to buy a 600 ohm headphone, whether the 880 or 990 or T1 or anything else for that matter, you don't need to spend tons of money on amplification. You don't need to experiment with a speaker amp, and probably shouldn't unless you want to be nominated for the Darwin Awards. Here's the bottom line. Both the P20 and Bellari are good amps. The Bellari is a cleaner amp whether or not you want to swap the tubes. But maybe you want a balanced amp like the P20. Rest assured, both amps drive the 880 quite well. As for other headphones, well, I hope the survey of headphones I tested in this video give you an idea of how your particular headphones might perform. I do not think there is a right or wrong answer between these amps. Just pick one that suits you.